in a conservative Catholic family, and I lived in the very conservative panhandle of Florida, or as we refer to it, Lower Alabama. For anyone that doubts the conservative credentials of where I grew up, Matt Gaetz went to the same high school I did. So I didn't exactly grow up in a world where caring and compassion for people that were different than you was a thing. Fortunately for me, I went away to college in Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida, very different place. At FAU, I was surrounded by people with all kinds of backgrounds, beliefs, cultures, and religious faiths. Although there were plenty of examples of people that clashed, in our little dorm suite of 8 people, the Italian Catholic kid definitely struggled with his roommate who was gay. The only person in that suite of 8 that always got along with everyone was Matt, not Matt Gaetz, a very, very different Matt. He just had a way that no matter who he was talking to, he showed them the same level of respect. So the spring of that year, Matt said his family was inviting all of us, our little suite of 8, over for Passover Seder. I had no real experience with Jewish faith, so I was excited and interested. So there we are that night, 2 Catholics, 1 Baptist, 2 atheists, and one gay Christian, and a Muslim exchange student sitting around the table with Matt and his family. That night, I saw a family that was not only able to demonstrate their reverence for the traditions of the Passover Seder, but they also were able to process all of our random, often unintentionally offensive questions. At the end of the night, the Muslim exchange student asked the question that I'm sure was in all of our minds. He asked Matt's family, why were they willing to invite a bunch of strangers into their home for what was clearly something very important to them, and which was also clearly very disruptive. Matt's mom, with a big smile on her face, told us that we were the people that Matt spent most of his time with at college, and that we were, in effect, Matt's family there. They wanted us to understand where Matt came from, and that this was the part that really stuck to me, that they wanted us to know how grateful they were that we were a part of Matt's life. That night, Matt's family treated 2 Catholics, 1 Baptist, 2 atheists, 1 gay Christian, and 1 Muslim exchange student with love and compassion, and I knew where Matt got it from. The understanding demonstrated to others that day is a lesson I have tried to live with since. Thank you.
When I was 8 years old, I had dreams of escaping my home and seeking my liberation. Now, before you get worried about my childhood, I want to reassure you, there are many people who suffer abuse in their families and truly need to escape when they are 8 years old. I was not one of those people. I had a warm home, I had meals, I had parents who cared for me, I was provided an education, clothes, comfort, and support. Now, I don't remember what my grievances were. Probably that I had to eat all my vegetables before I could leave the table, or that I had an enforced bedtime at 8 p.m. But I was aggrieved and ready to leave. I had under my bed a bandana with a number of my favorite materials in them. I was in search of a stick to tie. You know where this is going, right? Anyone who's in my generation knows that you take the bandana, you tie it onto the stick, you put it over your shoulder, and you go off in search for adventures and the promise of a better land. I had the bandana under my bed for months. As a child who grew up in Christian Sunday school, I had good models for this wandering in the desert. I had heard the stories of the Old Testament as I knew it when I was growing up, escaping from slavery in Egypt and wandering for 40 years, until they found the Promised Land. God had told them to go and had provided protection on the long journey. Somehow, I must have thought that that protection would extend to me too. Now, you'll be relieved to know that I didn't go. I realized I had a pretty good thing at home, and it turns out that all the food and warm clothing you need doesn't fit into a bandana. In our sermon series this year, we are exploring where we can find hope in these really challenging times in our world, in our country, in our hearts. And particularly, we are exploring how different religions look at hope of liberation for oppressed people. We have explored liberation theology, its roots in South America, and its focus on liberating the poor and oppressed, and we're exploring how it was discussed in humanism and Buddhism, and today we are exploring it in Judaism. And like the other services, I have to offer a massive caveat that it doesn't give near enough attention to all of the nuances and differences that exist within each faith. I am not from these faiths, and we are giving a sliver of it. But honestly, I don't know if there's a better example of liberation and an oppressed people than the stories of the Hebrew Bible. Hope and liberation had to be at the forefront of Judaism because despair and occupation have been such a huge part of the history. Some of the key stories and history of the Jews and Judaism come from the resilience and escape from oppression. The ancestors of Abraham and Sarah were enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, and Moses led them out of slavery and protected them for those 40 years in the desert, separating them from their oppressors by the parting of the Red Sea. As God called them to do, they set up land in Canaan and created a temple where they believed that God dwelled, until they were conquered and exiled again by the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE, and that temple was destroyed. They returned again and built a second temple, only to have that temple destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century. From floods to plagues to death of their firstborns, the Jews of the Hebrew Bible have suffered, have been resilient, and have relied on God to aid in their liberation. Karen Ehrlichman, who is a Jewish studies professor, says that a Jewish community joke is that Jewish history might be summed up in a pithy maxim involving food. They tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. Passover can be included in that one. Now, Reverend Laura and I had the most excellent professor in seminary, Dr. Amy Erickson. She took offense when people said that the Hebrew Bible, which the Torah is part of, also known in Christianity as the Old Testament, was just a book of violence and an angry God. She said that that missed the point. To her, it was a book about covenant between God and the Jewish people. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we know a lot about covenant. We know that we make covenant, we break covenant, and we have to go back and make it again. And that is what the Hebrew Bible teaches over and over again. Much like our relationships with our parents, each side promised something, the covenant was broken, and it needed to be repaired again. And like the relationships with our parents, the relationship between God and the Jews was complicated. The Jews often messed up, and God was often displeased. But they restored the covenant again, and God protected and liberated them again. And then you get to the modern era and the ultimate oppression of a religious group in the Holocaust. Now, to be very clear, the evolution of Christianity is directly responsible for the atrocities of the deaths of over 6 million Jews. At the time, Christianity believed that Jews were being punished for their sins of turning away from Jesus and God, even though Jesus was Jewish. But the Nazis didn't need complex theological reasons to hate Jews. The Nazi mission was to annihilate all Jewish people based on their faith alone. So there were a lot of Jews who were really questioning their covenant with God during that time, their faith and where God was. Where was God in this suffering? Why had God forsaken them? How could they believe in a God that would allow this mass extermination of his chosen people? And beyond the belief in God, how are all of us supposed to believe in humanity if this is what humans can do to other humans? What are we supposed to do with this level of suffering? And where do we find a theology of hope or liberation in this situation? The book that we're drawing much of this series from has an excellent essay by Mark H. Ellis, who's a university professor and a director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Baylor University. He is a leader in liberation theology and Judaism, and he writes about what comes next from a liberation theology perspective in Judaism in the light of the Holocaust. I have links to the book. I have copies of his essay. I think it's so good that you all should read it. Ellis notes that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews wrestled with their faith, but they were also determined never again to be unprotected and vulnerable to the power of another state. Coming directly out of the Holocaust, the Israeli state in their promised land, whether you call it Canaan, Judea, or Israel, was created in 1948. And it was solidified after the Israeli-Arab War in 1967. And the Israeli state grew to have power, wealth, and the support of powerful countries, especially the United States. They grew to have a very aggressive military power to make sure that nothing like the Holocaust could ever happen again. Now, would the Holocaust have happened if the Israeli state had existed? Ellis says that historically, the answer to that is theoretical, but Jews could never afford to test that theory again. The state of Israel was absolutely necessary so that no one would attempt such an assault on Jews ever again. Never again would Jews be weak and helpless. Never again would Jews go down without a fight. The problem was that Palestinians also lived in that area, and that area is called Israel and Palestine together. And as the Israeli state would grow stronger and richer and have more power, the Palestinian areas became more isolated, more controlled, more oppressed, and smaller as Israeli settlements encroached on the land. And the promises of separate and autonomous countries from that 1948 plan never happened. More than anything else, this is the situation that gave me the most conflict on my recent trip to the Holy Land. For me, I went in with the knowledge of Jews having experienced so much religious oppression through their history, and they have had to have so much resilience. It is baked into the rich, deep Jewish faith. And it shook me to my core to experience the extent of oppression of the Palestinian people that the state of Israel oversaw. Ellis is also challenged by this situation and explores it as the next opportunity of liberation theology in Judaism. He says that the Holocaust remains, and appropriately so, a permanent warning of what human beings will do to other human beings when they are defined outside of the protection of the state and the dominant religious and cultural sensibility. No people should ever be too strong or too weak, and thus they would avoid the temptation of aggression and submission. Intervention on behalf of a weaker party is mandatory before the situation escalates into genocide or Holocaust. But what happens when the formerly weak, harassed, and murdered people gain power, expand that power, occupy another nation, settle on its land, and seek to destroy its capacity to organize and define itself as a political entity? Then what if all of this is done in the name of the victims of the Holocaust, in the name of self-defense, fulfilling what everyone agrees upon? Never again, end quote. Ellis presents the opportunity to truly wrestle with the Jewish faith, lifting up liberation for all people and removing the shackles of colonialism and imperialism. And that is not just a social justice opportunity, but a true promise, an opportunity to live into the promise of Judaism. After all, he says, the origin of the Jewish faith was of a people who were slaves. They called forth a God of liberation who led them to leave the empire of Egypt behind and bid them to construct a community of justice and equality. They were called not just to the land of Israel, but to reject the structures of empire as they created their communities. The history and faith of the Jewish people is rich and layered with ideals that overlap with ours as Unitarian Universalists, that of covenant, that of liberation, and adaptation. It is a faith that understands suffering and looks to their faith for that hope and resilience. And my great hope, my prayer, if you will, is that it will be a faith that guides Jews of conscience to balance the understandable need for protection with the liberation of all people, especially to those who are currently exiled in and from their own land, as the Jews once were. May we be united as we pray for peace. May we be united as we work for justice. And may we look to our faith, all of our collective faiths, for we too come from Abraham. May we too look as our conscience guides us to liberation for all of us. So might it be.